1945, a year that began in darkness and ended in fire, ashes, and the birth of a new world. The Second World War had raged for over 5 years, a storm that swallowed continents, consumed millions, and left no soul untouched. But as the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 1945, few could see the end. Only exhaustion, rubble, and the haunting question: how much more could humanity endure? Winter hung heavy over Europe. Cities that once glowed with life now lay shattered skeletons of stone. In the east, the Soviet Union was closing in. Millions of Red Army soldiers pushed relentlessly toward Berlin. In the west, the Allied forces under Eisenhower regrouped after the brutal surprise of Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. And across the Pacific, a different hell was unfolding. On the islands of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond, every front, every soldier, every nation could feel it. The war was reaching its breaking point. But victory in 1945 was not just about winning. It was about surviving the end of the world and facing what came after. In Germany, Adolf Hitler still clung to his dream of a 1,000-year Reich. But by 1945, that dream had become a nightmare. His empire was collapsing. Cities like Cologne, Dresden, and Berlin were reduced to ash under waves of Allied bombings. Millions of civilians fled westward, desperate to escape the advancing Soviets, whose vengeance was fierce and unrelenting. The streets of Berlin echoed with the sound of boots, of fear, of the inevitable. Inside the Führer bunker, beneath the ruined Reich Chancellery, Hitler sat surrounded by maps that no longer matched reality. He issued orders to armies that no longer existed, cursed generals who had long stopped listening, and waited for an end he refused to accept. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied leaders gathered. In February 1945, 3 men met in a place called Yalta, a Crimean resort scarred by war: Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the so-called Big Three. They were the victors in waiting, carving up the post-war world even before the guns fell silent. Their talks were civil, but beneath the smiles lay mistrust and ambition. Stalin wanted Eastern Europe under Soviet control. Churchill wanted to protect the British Empire's fading influence. Roosevelt dreamed of a new world order, one led not by empires but by cooperation. It was an uneasy alliance, one that would soon fracture into the Cold War. But back in Europe, the fighting had not stopped. In March, the Rhine River, once Germany's natural defense, was breached. American troops crossed it in a daring move, establishing a bridgehead that would seal Germany's fate. By April, Allied forces were sweeping through central Germany, liberating concentration camps whose horrors would shock the conscience of mankind. At Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, soldiers saw what no victory could ever erase: piles of bodies, skeletal survivors, and the truth of industrialized death. The world would never again doubt the cruelty of the Nazi regime, or forget the faces of its victims. On April 12, 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Berlin, President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat for a portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia. Moments later, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died. The man who had led America through the Great Depression and most of World War II was gone. His successor, Vice President Harry S. Truman, suddenly found himself at the helm of the most powerful nation on Earth, with decisions ahead that would change human history forever. In Berlin, the final act began. Soviet artillery thundered across the city. Street by street, block by block, the Red Army advanced. Hitler refused to flee. He retreated into his underground bunker, ranting about betrayal and vengeance. On April 30th, as Soviet troops closed within a few hundred meters, Adolf Hitler took his own life. The man who had plunged the world into war ended it with a gunshot in a concrete tomb. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the guns finally fell silent. Crowds flooded the streets of London, Paris, and New York. People danced, kissed, and wept. After 6 long years, the war in Europe was over. But even as bells rang across the West, half a world away, the fighting still raged on. In the Pacific, Japan refused to surrender. The Imperial Army fought with fanatic determination, defending every island, every rock, to the last man. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa became symbols of human endurance and horror. At Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 Americans were killed capturing a tiny island, a patch of volcanic ash that became sacred ground. At Okinawa, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians died. The sky filled with kamikaze pilots, men who turned their planes into bombs, their bodies into weapons. The Allies faced a grim truth. If Japan had to be invaded, millions more would die, soldiers and civilians alike. So in secret, a new weapon was being prepared. In the deserts of New Mexico, scientists working under the Manhattan Project had harnessed the power of the atom. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen or imagined possible. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. bomber Enola Gay flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it released a single bomb. Little boy. In an instant, a city vanished. 70,000 people died within seconds. Fires raged, shadows burned into walls, and the world crossed into the nuclear age. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Another city erased, another tens of thousands of lives gone. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed across Japan. The first time his people had ever heard him speak. He announced that Japan would surrender. Not in defeat, he said, but to save the people from further suffering. For the first time in history, humanity had witnessed its own power to destroy itself completely. When the war finally ended, the numbers defied comprehension. Over 70 million dead. Entire cities gone, families scattered, cultures scarred, generations changed forever. But amid the ruins, the world began to rebuild. Nations gathered in San Francisco to sign the charter of a new organization, the United Nations. Its goal, to prevent another world war, to promote peace through dialogue rather than destruction. It was an ideal born from ashes, fragile yet vital. Germany was divided, east and west, democracy and communism. Berlin became the symbol of a new conflict, the Cold War. In Asia, Japan was occupied and rebuilt under American guidance, transforming from empire to democracy. Europe was reshaped by the Marshall Plan, America's effort to restore stability and prevent the spread of Soviet influence. And the world watched as 2 new superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union, standing at the dawn of an atomic age. 1945 was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of everything that came after. The modern world, its politics, its fears, its hopes, all trace back to that single year. A year when humanity touched both its darkest depths and its brightest potential. Out of the ruins of Berlin rose a divided world. Out of Hiroshima, a warning that peace must never again depend on the destruction of millions. And out of the ashes of 1945, nations dared to dream of unity, justice, and peace, even as new shadows gathered on the horizon. The war to end all wars did not end war, but it did change us forever. In 1945, humanity proved it could destroy itself, and in that same year, it began the long, uncertain journey to ensure it never would again. This was 1945, the year the old world died and the modern world was born.